Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're tackling a really significant topic, and let's be honest, a pretty debated one. Volodymyr Zelenskyy and the, well, immense financial support Ukraine's received from the West since the 2022 invasion.
Mm.
The big question we're really trying to unpack in this deep dive is this. Is Zelenskyy, primarily a heroic figure, skillfully getting the crucial aid his country needs to survive? Or is there maybe a compelling case that he's leveraging Western willingness, maybe Western strategic priorities, in a way that some might see as exploitative?
It's a tough question. It really sits right at the intersection of, well, a desperate wartime situation, very complex international politics, and, like you said, truly massive amounts of money.
Massive is right.
We're talking over $300 billion, mainly from the U.S., the EU, and other Western allies. I mean, that kind of figure, it inevitably invites intense scrutiny, doesn't it? Raises some really fundamental questions.
Absolutely. And what really struck me going through the source material is just how differently his efforts are seen. It's quite stark.
Yeah.
You've got people who see him as, I don't know, almost an icon, right? A modern symbol of resilience, doing whatever it takes against a huge aggressor.
But a defender narrative.
Exactly. And then on the flip side, you have those who see someone more maybe calculating, expertly working the global stage to keep that pipeline of resources flowing.
Right.
So our goal today is really to try and get beneath those, surface level takes and understand the complexities, what's actually going on with Zelensky's fundraising.
Okay, so maybe we should start with the methods. How has he actually gone about it?
Good idea.
Our sources detail his frequent visits to key Western capitals, Washington, Brussels, Berlin. He's become a very familiar face in those circles. And they also highlight the nature of his speeches. These aren't just dry reports, are they? They're carefully put together appeals. They weave together personal stories, a lot of emotional resonance, and very direct, sometimes really urgent requests for help.
He is a compelling speaker, no doubt about that, and clearly very skilled at drawing connections that resonate with Western audiences emotionally.
Definitely.
Like the references you see to 9/11 or World War II. It's a powerful rhetorical move, isn't it? Linking Ukraine's fight to deeply held Western values, key moments in their own histories.
And you can see the results. The material we looked at mentions that 2022 Washington trip resulted in, $45 billion in aid?
Astonishing number.
And in the 2024 European tour, another $50 billion from the EU, plus significant military commitments from different countries. I mean, these are genuinely enormous sums.
They really are.
Now, what's interesting, though, is to look at the other interpretation. The critics, as our sources point out, they don't just attribute this success to the justice of Ukraine's cause.
Right.
They also point to his background. A former actor, someone who understands charisma, understands media, how to effectively pitch Ukraine's needs to keep the funds coming.
So the question they're asking, and it's a fair one to raise, is this just pure wartime necessity? A leader doing absolutely everything required for survival?
Is there maybe an element of, let's say, calculated exploitation?
Yeah.
Taking advantage of Western goodwill? Maybe there's strategic anxieties?
Okay, let's dig into that idea of exploitation a bit more by looking at the sheer financial weight of this aid for the West.
Yeah, the burden.
Because the numbers, as you said, are just immense. Over $113 billion from the U.S. alone since 2022. And there's more pledged. The EU's committed $100 billion. Then you've got the UK, Germany, tens of billions more.
Huge contributions across the board.
And the source material brings up this argument. This is basically a massive transfer of wealth from Western taxpayers to another country. And a key worry voiced by critics is, well, the perceived lack of really tight oversight. Are these funds being used properly?
That oversight piece is, it's critical. If you think about it from the perspective of taxpayers in those countries,
Of course.
it's completely understandable they'd want assurances, right? How's our money being spent? What systems are there to make sure it's effective, used as intended?
Especially when you consider the source reminds us about Ukraine's economy before the war. Its reliance on agriculture, but also that established history of corruption issues.
Right. Which raises a difficult question. Could an economy with that kind of background realistically absorb such huge sums of outside aid without, significant external management, and potentially without some funds going astray?
It's a valid concern, and we should probably note, tracking military aid in a war zone is incredibly difficult compared to, say, direct budget support, which might have clearer audit trails.
Absolutely different challenges.
There was that pretty blunt comment from an ex-user in 2024 that kind of stuck with me. It's something like, Zelensky lands, speaks, and leaves with our cash. It's a slick operation.
Yeah, that captures a certain cynical view, definitely, but it reflects a sentiment that's out there.
And the source does float this idea that perhaps Western leaders, driven by their own strategic goals, containing Russia, upholding democracy, maybe they're not scrutinizing these aid requests as intensely as they might in other situations. Less urgent ones, perhaps.
Exactly. I mean, compared to normal international loans,
Yeah.
usually there are very specific strings attached, right? Accountability frameworks, repayment plans.
Strict conditions.
Very strict. The source suggests that with Ukraine aid, especially early on, maybe there was this sense of extreme urgency, a greater willingness to push money out the door without all the usual checks and balances.
And that perception, that idea of a Western blank check, well, that certainly adds fuel to the arguments of those who see Zelensky's fundraising as potentially exploitative.
Which brings us, doesn't it, straight to the very sensitive and complex issue of corruption.
Yeah. The source material points out Ukraine's pre-war ranking 122nd on Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index. Not great.
Not great at all. And okay, Zelensky did campaign on an anti-corruption platform back in 2019.
It did.
But critics argue those deep-seated systemic problems. They don't just vanish overnight, especially not during a war.
And there have been allegations swirling around misallocated aid, diverted funds, dodgy contracts. Although the source is careful to note, concrete proof is often hard to come by.
It is. And what's really worth highlighting is that 2023 U.S. report that was mentioned. It specifically raised concerns about just how difficult it is to effectively track military aid in an active war zone.
Right, the practical reality on the ground.
It underlines the huge challenges in ensuring total transparency and accountability in that kind of volatile, high-stakes environment.
So when you put those pre-existing corruption concerns together with the sheer difficulty of oversight during a war, you can see why questions get raised about potential misuse, even if it's not, directed from the very top.
And the argument from the critics then becomes, Zelensky's ongoing success in getting these huge aid packages, despite these corruption worries. Well, maybe it suggests Western governments are prioritizing the immediate goal, countering Russia, over maybe more rigorous, long-term accountability.
Okay, let's shift gears slightly and look at the strategic angle here.
The geopolitical dimension.
Yeah. Supporters of Zelensky, the source highlights this view. They argue his fundraising isn't about exploitation at all. It's driven by sheer necessity, national survival against a massive enemy.
Yeah, existential threat argument.
Exactly. They stress that Ukraine is effectively on the front lines of a bigger geopolitical contest. Without this steady aid, the country could collapse, which could embolden other authoritarian powers. So, Ukraine acts as a vital buffer for the West.
Makes sense. But then you have the more critical take.
Which is?
That Zelensky is actually skillfully using that very geopolitical position to maximize the aid Ukraine gets. By constantly framing Ukraine as the West's main defense against Russian expansion, they argue he creates what the source calls a kind of moral and strategic trap.
A trap? Explain that.
Well, it makes it politically incredibly difficult for Western leaders to say no to his requests, even if they have private doubts, or face pressure back home about spending.
Ah, I see. Because refusing looks like abandoning the cause.
Precisely. It's not just emotional appeals, it plugs right into that core Western narrative of defending democracy against authoritarianism. Appearing to back away from that is politically risky for those leaders, even if the practicalities get complicated.
That example of Zelensky's 2024 victory plan seems relevant here.
Very illustrative, yeah.
His demands NATO membership, unrestricted arms. Some observers felt they were, well, maybe overly ambitious, perhaps unrealistic in the current climate.
Right. Seemed like a big ask.
Yet, the source points out, even that assertive stance still led to more concessions, more commitments of support from allies, which, certainly in the eyes of critics, seems to reinforce this idea that he's remarkably good at extracting resources by playing on Ukraine's strategic importance.
And this brings us to another critical point. What's the impact of all this on Western societies themselves? Right,
the domestic side.
The source is right to point out the big domestic debates happening because of the sheer amount of aid going to Ukraine, especially in the U.S., where there are always arguments about funding priorities, healthcare, infrastructure, whatever else.
Competing needs.
Exactly. And in Europe, too, you've got ongoing economic pressures, energy security worries, and you hear this growing public frustration about so much money going elsewhere.
And we're seeing that play out politically, aren't we? The source mentions the rise of populist movements like France's National Rally, Germany's AfD.
Yes, those groups are definitely tapping into that discontent, often painting Zelensky in Ukraine as, a drain on local resources.
It throws up a potential paradox, doesn't it? Zelensky's very success in getting this vital aid, could it actually inadvertently be weakening the political will and public support in the West that he fundamentally relies on?
It's a real risk. As the initial sort of wave of solidarity perhaps shifts into the reality of a long, drawn-out conflict,
Yeah.
these constant large-scale demands could start to alienate taxpayers, people who don't see a direct, tangible benefit for themselves.
It's a sobering thought that his success in keeping Ukraine fighting might, down the line, create new problems for funding that fight.
And if that public support in donor countries really drops off significantly,
Right.
well, that could force Western leaders to rethink, maybe even cut back their financial and military help.
Which would obviously be devastating for Ukraine's
It's
defense.
absolutely devastating. So there's this very delicate balance, potentially an unsustainable one, at play here.
Okay, so as we start to wrap up our deep dive, where do we land on this complex role Zelensky is playing?
Well, it seems the reality, as the source suggests, is probably a mix of things. It's nuanced. He's undoubtedly leading a country facing, an existential threat. So a huge part of his relentless fundraising must be driven by genuine critical need, survival.
You have to assume so.
But it's also undeniable that he's shown extraordinary persuasive skills, a real knack for understanding how to appeal to Western audiences, how to align Ukraine's needs with their strategic interests.
Yeah, that combination seems key.
Absolutely. And those persistent worries about corruption in Ukraine, plus the questions about full transparency, how the aid is really being used, those remain major factors. They keep fueling the skepticism, keep allowing that narrative of potential exploitation to stick around.
And as long as Western taxpayers are footing a massive bill,
The debate about his motives and whether this level of support can last, it's just going to continue, isn't it?
ultimately he's a figure who generates really strong opposing views. His visits to the West bring in billions, yes, but as our source concludes, maybe at a cost that's becoming harder for some donor nations to sustain.
So we circle back to that central question we started with. Hero, tenaciously fighting for survival. Or is there a valid case for seeing him as, maybe to some degree, exploiting Western resources and interests?
And as we've explored, the answer isn't simple. It's really not black and white. It heavily depends on your perspective, right? Which factors you give the most weight to.
Exactly.
We hope this deep dive has given you, the listener, a better grasp of all the different angles here. The sheer urgency for Ukraine, the huge scale of Western aid, those legitimate concerns about accountability and corruption, and, importantly, the real political and economic impacts back in the countries providing the support.
And maybe, as you think about the long view, the implications for both Ukraine and the West.
Yeah.
It raises a final thought to consider. Given the lasting impact this will have on everyone involved, what could be the most sustainable, maybe the most ethical ways to handle international aid and conflict resolution in situations like this one?
Yeah, it's a huge question. No easy answers there.
Not at all. But definitely one worth keeping in mind as we navigate, an increasingly complex world.